Thank you, Lorraine and June. It's often said that history is written by the winners. And of course, there's a great deal of truth behind that maxim. It's true that the standard canonical narrative, if we can call it that, or the mainstream story, that it's going to be pushed by those who are in power and those who stand to gain from that. So it's good to question where our stories are coming from, to question from whose perspective a story is being told, and to ask how a story has been used, to what effect, who gains from it. These are all important things to consider. But if history is any teacher, we also know that the histories that are written by the losers too. That lost causes emerge, that old wounds fester, and the conflict moves from the battlefield to the stories that we tell and the heroes that we choose to memorialize. You see, revisionist history can come from many different interests and motivations, some good, some bad, some not so clear. But that's because history, all history, is inherently selective. That is, doing history isn't just the collection and communication of random facts. It's the attempt to make some kind of sense of those facts by telling a story that connects with purpose, interest, and our values. For example, historians of Abraham Lincoln are probably not going to spend a whole lot of time describing the wallpaper at Ford's Theater. It's probably not that relevant. Historians of the atom bomb are probably not going to write grants to fund research into what J. Robert Oppenheimer had for breakfast on his first day of second grade. Probably not relevant. Historians may try to understand how Madeleine Albright's pins conveyed subtle foreign policy messages, but they might be less concerned about where she learned her pitching form when she threw a ceremonial first pitch at an Orioles game. The relevance is relative. So again, every moment in history presents us with an incalculable universe of data. But it's the historian's job to tell a story that is not only faithful to the evidence, but also guided by certain interests and a specific purpose. And all of this selectivity makes me wonder about who chooses our heroes and why. Whose stories are held up as exceptional and history-making? When I was in college, I was obsessed with the German monk and Protestant reformer Martin Luther. I was completely taken by how this little anxiety-stricken monk from a backwater German town somehow launched a religious and political reform movement that would echo through the centuries. I mean, there were many reformers before him. There were reformers after him. But why was it that this one stuck? This one set the chain reaction that became the Protestant Reformation. How does a little act, like nailing your op-ed to a church door, suddenly become the spark that sets the Protestant church into motion throughout Europe? I was fascinated by this, and still am. And yet over time, as I studied Luther's life, I realized that though he was a remarkable person in his own right, flaws and all, the Reformation was the result of things far beyond Luther, things that preceded him by centuries and decades, and people who perpetuated his ideas or appropriated his ideas that perpetuated the Reformation in its own way in other parts of Europe. Even when you look at Luther's own life, it was not a product of his own calculation, but also the result of a diverse cast of characters and conditions that influenced Luther just the way that a habitat influences a bird or a deer. There was his father confessor. There was his own father. There was Augustine, many centuries earlier, whose writings and whose order influenced the way that Martin thought about theology. There was the Apostle Paul. There were the proto-reformers. And then there was all of the dissatisfaction with certain elements of the Catholic tradition as they had come to be in that particular moment in history. In other words, there were parallels and convergences before, during, and after Luther that made the European Reformation what it was. So then why? Why is history so often presented to us as the consequence of a single hero's action? Well, in the beginning of the book of Exodus, we are told about a hero who will become Israel's great prophet, Israel's great liberator and shepherd. But at the beginning of this hero's journey, he is saved by no less than 5 women. And these women are present in different ways in the story. First, there are the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. And we have no idea what their proximity to Moses is, but these women shrewdly and courageously stood up to Pharaoh in his genocidal conspiracy to murder Hebrew newborns. These women engage in active resistance against Pharaoh, even while telling him, well, the Hebrew women are vigorous, hardy. They just pop these babies out before we can get there. But they directly opposed this policy. And this allowed for the nation of Israel to grow in number and strength, and played an important role in their becoming a liberation movement later on. Second, there is Moses' mother and Miriam, his sister. These two managed to defy Pharaoh in even more subtle ways by creatively hiding the baby Moses. In a subtle way, they even conformed to the policy by casting Moses into the river, although they do so in a way that protects the baby. And this results in him being found and eventually being cared for by none other than Pharaoh's daughter, which in turn employs Miriam and Moses to care for the baby. And finally, there's Pharaoh's daughter herself. We don't know exactly why Pharaoh's daughter took Moses in. Was it out of pity? Was it out of rebellion against her father? Was this the only way she could have a child? It's not clear. All the text gives us is that she suspects that this is one of the Hebrew children. And if we indulge in speculation a little bit further, it seems fairly obvious that Pharaoh would have known about this adoption. Did he allow it because he just wanted to indulge his daughter? Was he making a political calculation? Maybe he thought that by raising a Hebrew boy in his household that he might later use Moses as a propaganda tool or a political pawn later on. We just don't know. But we do know how the story goes, don't we? Because of all of these parallels and convergences, Moses goes on to reject the privilege of his palace upbringing. He chooses to identify instead with the oppression of his Hebrew people. And even though he runs away to escape the consequences of his own violent resistance, he is called back 40 years later by a God who hears the cries of the oppressed. And Moses is called to confront the supreme power of Egypt in the name of the supreme power of freedom, the God who is. But none of it, would have happened without at least these 5 women who did what they did. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is an acclaimed Nigerian author, and in her TED Talk on the danger of a single story, she talks about how single stories create stereotypes that rob people of their dignity. And she uses as an example all the images of Africa that are often portrayed in Western media. The children who are naked with distended bellies, the war, the guns, the rape, all of these stories that are proliferate in our media consumption. And yet these realities do not define her upbringing as a Nigerian. It's not that they are untrue, but that they are not the whole truth. They are a single story that is often consumed by those who are not faced with multiple stories or choose not to hear multiple stories. And this is where stereotypes come from. When we work with multiple stories, however, we acquire a richer, deeper familiarity with the complexities of others, and we can better understand both our differences as well as our similarities as human beings. And yet I want to take that idea, the danger of the single story, and apply it not just to others, but also to the ways that we understand our own stories. For example, do we really think that we are creatures of our own making? Have we adopted a single story for ourselves? Do we dare to think that God's dream of a shalom kind of peace rises and falls with our own personal performance? Have we given in to the temptation to think that we are the heroes of our own narrative? Because such lofty and self-centered thinking makes for a lot of really bad days. Days when you don't measure up. Days when you're not good enough. Days when you don't understand why people's lives don't revolve around me. Days when you're living in pursuit of an idealized future that never comes. And if that's ever you, I don't know, it might be for me. I have some really good news. We are enough. Even while we are not finished. We are not alone. We are not alone in becoming who we are. The story of God's justice and liberation does not rise and fall with you or me. Nor is it complete without you and me. God is at work in so many divine parallels and many a holy convergence. Many holy convergences make up each of our stories. Living in the shadow of so many individual hero stories can lead us to believe that we are failures if we don't become those types of heroes ourselves. And yet the truth of history is that the heroes that we select and pay attention to or are selected and attended to for us, these are not always the people who make the biggest impacts. Some of the people who make the biggest impact on history and on the world never become household names. Some have even been lost to history completely. And those who we do pay attention to, those who are selected for us, These heroes would not be who they were or are without the involvement of so many others who will escape the eye of history. So what does this mean for us? You know, it doesn't matter whether history pays attention to us or not. It doesn't matter whether our stories make it into popular memory or local memory or family lore. What matters, as it mattered for Shiphrah, for Puah, for Miriam, for the unnamed women of this story, and for Moses himself. What matters is that we are faithful to God, to neighbor, and to ourselves. The rest will work itself out. I'm reminded of a story that's relayed in the Gospel of John, toward the end of that gospel. And Jesus begins to talk about the beloved disciple, and Peter said, "Well, what about this guy? What about this guy? What's going to happen to him?" And I pictured Jesus taking Peter by the cheeks and squeezing them together as he's looking at the beloved disciple. And squeezing those cheeks turns Peter's head toward himself, and Jesus says, "What's that to you? Follow me." I think that's what faithfulness looks like. Let other people's stories be other people's stories, but be faithful to who you are, to what your respective callings are. But know that if you fail, if you trip up, if you feel like you are not doing enough, remember that it's not all up to you. That whether you are Moses or a midwife, your heroism is yours alone to cultivate. The next faithful step is all you need to be present to. And the only one you need to follow is not Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, or any figure that you lift up as a good example, a faithful witness, a hero. As good as these stories are, as wonderful and inspirational as they can be, all you need to be faithful to, the only story that you were called to write, is your own. And even in that, you are just one contributor. If we do well in granting us this grace, I believe that we might also be agents of grace to others. Because at a time like this, when the political cycle is ramping up, and we start to think that all of history will rise and fall by who gets elected, I believe it will be important for us to remember that other people's stories are not up to us alone. That while we might contribute, that the stories that are cultivated by our neighbors, whether they are part of the system, like Pharaoh's daughter, or opposite to the system, like Shiphrah and Puah, that they are called to be faithful to their stories, however they differ from ours. What I hope that we hear from these stories, beloved, is that there are so many divine parallels, so many holy convergences for you, for me, for others. All we have to do is to be faithful to what we have before us, even as we are interconnected, even as we are dynamic and complicated creatures. Even while we think of ourselves as heroic, not heroic enough, as we look into history and we select for ourselves the heroes that we wish that our lives could be more like, the heroes that remind us to be more ourselves, the figures that we hope will push us past our limitations. Remember that these are just gifts. They are not determinations. These are suggestions. They are not definitions. Just like all of God's gifts, we can twist what we are given. But we can also be grateful. We can have gratitude. We can delight in the extraordinary abilities that others have been given, even while we cultivate our own in whatever measure. But at the end of the day, there is only you and God. And the faithfulness that you have shown to your story, I hope, will be less and less a mystery and more a divine gift in and of itself, not only for you, but for those who come after you. And remember. Amen. Peace I give you, Jesus said. And now let us share this extravagant gift with each other. The peace of God be with you. In the Talmud, in a section called Pirkei Avot, a wise rabbi said, "Do not be overwhelmed by the world's grief. Do justice now. Love mercy now, and walk humbly now. You are not called to complete the work, nor are you excused from it." So, beloved of God, go now receiving this benediction. May you resist the powers that use people. May you hear the cries of the weak. May you dare to work for justice, knowing that God, source, word, and spirit, is your help, will keep you safe, and will bring you new life. You are blessed by God and sent now to serve. So go now in peace and in boldness. Amen.